When news of the new expansion model dropped, many people, including myself, were various levels of concerned. From outraged to cautiously optimistic, you saw just about every reaction. But that is not what this video is about. SotO clearly has had its pros and cons, but not only is its release cycle just not done yet, even if it was, I personally think it's too early to judge the new content delivery strategy that works on a far different timeline to what we've had before after just 1 year and 1 expansion. You know, when judging something, I generally prefer to look at the actual evidence that is there and not make up a scenario out of thin air and then judge everything based on that. So let's do exactly that. By which I mean, look at what we actually have, not the other thing. Because I think what is in SotO and how it's structured can tell us a lot about ANET's current and most likely future strategies and philosophies concerning the game. Also, here's your spoiler warning. I will be talking about the story as well as the rest of the expansion's contents, though I won't be spoiling any major reveals that happen in it. Speaking of story, let's start there. The SotO story appears to be largely self-contained. While the End of Dragons epilogue did put a focus on demons as an enemy type, the actual events of Yaladelv appear to have very little bearing on SotO. The Oni did get a cool bit of extra lore, but that was only mentioned offhandedly, and that's about it. In fact, you can probably count the amount of things that connect SotO to the rest of the game's story on one hand. At least if you don't include the many bits of background lore. And I think this is very likely intentional. Basically, ever since the game started in 2012, the story has been tied to the overarching narrative of the Dragon Cycle, arguably even before that with the books. And while they have managed to tie other storylines into this over the years, I can't even begin to imagine how freeing it must be as a writer at ANET to no longer have to worry about doing that. SotO in many ways is a fresh start, and they seem to be taking full advantage of that. You don't need to have experienced the past 10 years of story to make sense of Secrets of the Obscure. Most characters are new, and the one major returning player, Soja, only requires you to understand a little bit of backstory that can be boiled down to did some fighting, bad shit has happened, got hurt, got sad, the end. That is all you need to know about her. And it's my theory that this is how the story will be handled in future expansions too, which does come with its own set of benefits and drawbacks. But it just makes a lot of sense from ANET's perspective. Making the story more self-contained plays into the vertical progression that sets Guild Wars 2 apart from its competitors like Final Fantasy XIV. Being able to tell people that are looking to join the game that all they have to do is go through the pretty quick core leveling process, and then they can immediately join the shiny new content without feeling like they're missing out on anything is a pretty strong marketing gimmick. It's also not the only MMO using this model, or at least something similar to it. While yes, the most popular MMOs right now do follow a linear story, a different approach with more individual storylines has existed for a long time. It's present, for example, in a much more extreme form in games like Neverwinter Nights and its campaigns. The obvious downside is that the stories may end up feeling a little bit disconnected. Having largely self-contained storylines means that we can't really carry over as many major characters from previous storylines or have full character arcs spanning across multiple expansions, or have the stakes and threats of the story carried directly over from one into the next, as it was with Living World. Every story will need to have a very clear beginning, middle, and end. However, that is not to say that they can't be connected at all. That would be a pretty silly claim, to be honest. There are easy ways of reintroducing characters quickly to new audiences with all the info they need to understand their story. Commonly, this would be done by having somebody else explain it. For example, for a future storyline, we could meet with Marjorie and Casimir at their bar, and catch them while they are currently making introductions with a potential client of Jory's. Overhearing the conversation, which can then catch up people who don't know who these two are, and essentially giving them the rundown on what their deal is. You can make this even simpler by just getting one of the new characters that are introduced and having them just outright ask what somebody's deal is in one of those optional conversations. That can get a little annoying when you do it too many times in quick succession, but it's not hard to reintroduce characters this way. Though overall, in the future, I think we'll see a more limited number of returning characters with each chapter of the story that will then play a major role, and a much larger cast of new characters alongside them. This is not totally different from how we've been doing it, considering the cast of Dragon's Watch and Extended Friends is quite large, and we've maybe had 3-ish focus characters with every storyline. It's just that the balance has now shifted in favor of introducing even more new characters to put a focus on. On the plot side of things, consequences of the previous storyline can still absolutely serve as the backstory for the new one. The difference is in how the transition is paced. Where previous storylines often led into each other by way of us chasing one high-stakes threat into the next, I think we'll see a lot more in-universe downtime between expansions in the future. Kind of the same way that EOD originally ended on a much calmer note. Though really it's a bit hard to get a feel for how these transitions might be handled in the future, quite simply because of how badly Delve was written. That whole release really did not inspire any confidence in the player base. Another interesting thing about the SotO story is the copious amounts of references and lore tidbits coming from all corners of the franchise. Seriously, shout out to the 3 other people here that recognized the name Dashka while playing through the story. At least for SotO, this appears to be the way they want to reward long-term fans of the story and the world, by introducing new ideas and details connected to things we've wanted to know in the past, even if they are not directly feeding into the main storyline. In itself, it's not a bad idea, and it's a very good fit for an expansion themed around the world's secrets, but I doubt that this level of self-referencing is sustainable in the long term. Though I do predict that in future expansions, these background lore details will still be present, just a lot more focused on particular topics and areas, since I believe that we might be spending quite a lot of time exploring various locations on Tyria that the player base has been asking for a long time. That's just a lot easier to do now that we no longer need a reason to shoehorn these locations into the Dragon Cycle storyline. By the length of this chapter, you might realize that I actually care quite a lot about the game's story. I've been thinking about making a real deep dive analysis on SotO's story and particularly its writing. If you might be interested in that, let me know in the comments. Anyway, moving on. So we've gone over how the new story structure benefits newer players, but that's far from the only thing that's designed for them. In fact, most of SotO appears to be focused around benefiting newer and more casual players. This, again, makes a lot of sense, since these types of players make up the majority of the population. The grind to get the Skyscale and legendary PvE armor being tied to raids are 2 specific pain points that have been relevant to these player groups for a long time. Now, personally, I have some thoughts about both of those, and I'm gonna keep them to myself for now, because that is a topic for another day. The intention, however, is pretty clear. Add accessibility to the things that people just want to have. And, I mean, hey, I got 4 years of use out of the Skyscale already. I don't consider my farming from back then unnecessary at all. I can very much see future expansions adding other streamlined options to the game's systems similar to this as well. The big one I can see, for example, being the acquisition of gear. But there's only so many things you can actually touch on here. I don't imagine that these types of changes can carry forward more than 1 or 2 expansions in the future, since actual updates and reworks of core game features, such as dailies becoming the Wizard's Vault, can't actually be packaged as expansion features, just things that release alongside them. So perhaps once they're done with these types of changes, we might see a little bit more general content, not necessarily hardcore endgame stuff. The schedule for things like Fractals and Strike CMs seems fairly cut and dry, but just other general content and systems perhaps. There are also other aspects that really point to ANET's intention to catch newer players up to speed as well. Like how there's just a ton of pop-ups on the new maps that directly explain mechanics to you, rather than making you figure them out. I have no idea how helpful these actually are to most people, but I really could do without them showing up every single time. Another example is Dagda. In the first strike mission, Celestial Observatory, she's given a crap load of health, relative to her fairly low difficulty, leading to people, especially those that play quite a bit of strikes, to complain that she's not worth doing because she just takes too long to kill, even with relatively speaking high DPS. However, I don't think that this is just ANET trying to counter power creep by increasing numbers. I think that the reason for this is so that no matter what group you have, no matter how much damage they do, you will see all of the mechanics at a pace where you can actually parse them and reasonably figure out what's going on, even if you're going in blind or going in casually. There are other fights where if you mix first-timers in with experienced players within the same pug group, the casuals will be none the wiser as to how the fight actually worked because all the phases just went by too quickly. The effectiveness of this method of teaching mechanics is potentially debatable, but an attempt has been made. Ideally, all of this new player orientation will benefit more hardcore players like myself in the long term as well, by gradually raising the standards that can be expected of the casual and open world playing population. Though that is going to be a slow process, and it's going to be interesting to see if that's even the intention, or just wishful thinking on my part. So, SotO commits to working on the experience for new and casual players. What else is worth looking at? Well, one other thing that ANET appears to be addressing with the expansion are the long-standing issues of sustainability just across the game and its concept. A lot can be said about the living world model, both good and bad, but one thing was entirely undeniable. We never really knew what we were getting in the next update, or when it was even coming out. With the expansion model, that's a thing of the past, as now we have very clearly scheduled content patches, one per quarter with known contents. And unlike previous expansions, this spreads out the content across a whole year rather than dumping it all on us at once and then getting no major content updates for nearly a year. Personally, I'm already enjoying the increased communication in this regard, but this model also strongly benefits player retention. Guild Wars 2 has had a bit of a reputation as the quote-unquote side MMO, the thing you play while your main game is going through a lull, which makes sense in a way, but led to a lot of people just never taking the game seriously at all, and that perception feeding into the general disinterest from the wider MMO player base. Clearer and more consistent updates should help with this quite a bit, and not doing everything at once can allow ANET to make at least small adjustments to upcoming content based on feedback for the mechanics of the previous patches, which is a nice side effect. I really don't see a downside to this model. Sure, some people might prefer it if they got all the planned content in one go and didn't have to wait for any of the updates, but that's a matter of preference, and a way of doing that quite frankly doesn't actually benefit the game itself in any way besides making the expansions seem larger despite containing the same amount of content in both versions. And no, they are not cheaping out on you by spreading out this content across a year. That is just not how live service games work. They do really need to get better about their marketing timing though. Getting up nothing but blog posts until the week before release is really not the way of doing things. All of this leaves us with the elephant in the room, the new monetization model. And now, one thing up front, I'm not going to be talking about prices here. How much somebody is willing to pay for literally anything varies wildly between people. So whether the price point is justified is ultimately something that only you can decide for yourself. The one thing I keep having to remind people is that Final Fantasy XIV and WoW players are also still paying a subscription fee on top of buying expansions. Just saying. Anyway, the part that I actually wanted to talk about is the fact that the new monetization model with the expansions seems to be allowing the game to no longer have to be carried pretty much exclusively by the gem store. And you might think that shift is kind of minor, but it really can allow Init more room to add in-game rewards in the form of skins, novelties, and some free access account upgrades. You know, the stuff we've been seeing in the Wizard's Vault. With Living World, it always just made more sense to keep some things gem store exclusive because, well, they needed people to buy stuff from the gem store to fund the game. And they still do, but the frequency increase of expected revenue from expansion releases by doing it once per year can allow them to be more generous with giving these types of rewards out for free as in-game earnable rewards. 2 mount skins, the Griffin from the Vault and the Cryptus Skyscale, don't seem like a lot just now, but it's already tripled the number of mount skins that you can earn without converting gold to gems, not counting the base skin. And I think in the future they no longer have to exclusively rely on titles and infusions as sought after cosmetics for rare drops to motivate people to do very specific contents for reasons other than gold or legendary materials. Rare mount skins is one of those things that gets people going crazy for some reason that I will never fully understand. Since, as discussed in the first point, the expansions are constructed to be more modular, they might also be planning that you don't necessarily have to buy every single expansion to enjoy the game if you're only playing casually or just don't value each of them highly enough. So that, despite them overall asking for more money, as a player, you can just grab whichever expansions interest you, play them, and then maybe if you want more, grab another one, but you don't have to pick up every single one if you don't feel like it. I mean, I know I'm probably buying every single one, but it's an interesting thing to consider. So to recap, what does SotO tell us about the future of the game? 1. Init is prioritizing newer and casual players through mechanics and the way they deliver new content. 2. There is an overall greater focus on accessibility and teaching people what they should actually be doing. 3. Older parts of the game with restricted or convoluted requirements are becoming more streamlined. 4. The new content release schedule encourages communication on Init's side and player retention on our side. 5. The new monetization model can be used to allow for more in-game earnable rewards, as opposed to the pure gem store exclusivity of things like mount skins. All in all, that does sound quite positive. Now they just actually have to execute these ideas well. SotO's release was absolutely riddled with bugs and issues, and there are still lots and lots of bugs and issues. And it came out right as the community was coming out from a low point between Yala being just not very good and a lot of controversial balance changes. And on a personal note, I am very lukewarm on the story so far. Nothing is ever perfect, but the quality of an idea's execution is crucial. Something with a middling concept can become beloved, and something with an amazing concept can become forgotten or even hated, depending entirely on how well it's done. So let's see them stick the landing. Right, I hope you enjoyed all that. This might have actually been the first script, at least of this length, that I wrote out in full. So I hope there was something interesting in there, and maybe you learned a thing or two. If you did, maybe like or subscribe, do the YouTube things. And if you have other ideas for topics that you might want me to cover or analyze, let me know. I'm always looking for more. With that, thank you for watching, and goodbye.